In most of Britain, we have a really clear system for working out what the food hygiene standards are like at any given restaurant. It's called a food hygiene rating. If it's a 5, it means that that restaurant was found by inspectors to have really good food hygiene practices. If it's a 0, then you probably want to avoid it. But what if it's a 4? I mean, that's not a perfect 5, so they must have done something wrong. But how serious is it? And what about a 3? It says generally satisfactory, but it's getting a little bit low down the scale. At what point should I not go to that restaurant? The inspections and the ratings are carried out and done by local authorities, but the system itself was designed and is overseen by the Food Standards Agency. So I decided I wanted to go straight to the source and ask them, should I eat at a restaurant that has a 3?
Yeah, it's a really great question. So, if you get a rating of 4, for example, what that means is on the day that the officer has done their inspection, they've maybe found some minor non-compliances. So maybe things aren't just as they should be, and they're not an immediate kind of risk to health, but they could be if they're left too long or they're not addressed. The lower you go down the scale, the more non-compliances the inspector has found. So a rating of 3 we see is generally satisfactory. You know, people should be reasonably comfortable eating in a premises of 3 or above. But what our research tells us is that as soon as you drop below that 3 and go into the 2 or the 1 or the 0, you're twice as likely to get ill from the food that you eat.
So that's the word from the Food Standards Agency. A 3 is the lowest number that you should be reasonably comfortable eating at. But I still don't understand, what do these numbers actually mean? What is the real difference between 2 and a 3 and a 4? Well, I dived into the guidelines that they use to actually assign these ratings, and it's pretty complicated. So I'm going to simplify it, but here's what I think you need to know. When an inspector visits a restaurant, they give that restaurant a score in 3 separate categories, which are then combined to work out the food hygiene rating. There are 2 categories about food hygiene, one in terms of the food itself, and one in terms of the environment in which the food is made. And then a 3rd category about the management of the restaurant. Basically, can we trust them? Now, for simplicity, I'm going to skim over that last one and focus on these 2, because these are the ones about food hygiene itself. So let's say a business has a perfect food hygiene rating of 5. What that means is that it either got a perfect score across every category, or it may have been marked down in one of the food hygiene categories by a single point, meaning in that category there was a good standard of compliance with only minor contraventions. That's the worst possible result that still gets a 5. Now moving down to a 4, that would mean that at worst the food hygiene scores were marked down by a single point in both areas. So that's still pretty good. Now moving down to a 3. The worst case scenario here is that food hygiene was marked down by 2 points in both areas. That would mean that there is some non-compliance, but it's not considered significant in terms of risk, although it may become significant if not addressed. What would that look like? Well, I got a hold of some inspection reports. These are the things that actually determine the food hygiene rating. For a food hygiene rating of 3, the report might contain a few isolated issues that are quite concerning, but not disastrous. Things like sausages being left out of the fridge, or during the inspection, it was observed that 2 members of staff handled raw chicken and continued to operate in the kitchen without washing their hands. Yeah, that's definitely not great, but that's pretty much the limit of what you can get away with and still get a rating of 3. But when you get down to a food hygiene rating of 2, that's when everything changes, because for a 2, there would have to be a major non-compliance with statutory obligations in at least one, but possibly both, of the food hygiene categories. At the time of inspection, a moth was found inside a container of black sugar syrup. Plastic tubs containing rancid, foul-smelling beef and liver were found on your premises. A bag of carrots was observed in a cardboard box in the rear storeroom. These carrots had numerous live insects all over them. To be clear, if the inspector thought that these ingredients were being served to customers, they'd shut them down immediately. These ingredients will just have been left somewhere in storage and forgotten about, but yeah, that's still going to get you marked down pretty harshly. Now, as I said, the inspection scheme is really complicated, and there are ways of getting knocked down to a 2 without the inspector seeing any actual food crimes in progress, but the only way to know that would be to get a hold of the inspection report. So if you see a rating of 2, all you can say for sure is that they might have done some wild stuff like this, whereas if it's a 3, you can say for sure that they didn't. But if 3 is what really matters, then why do we have all the other numbers? Why wouldn't you just have everything below a 3 be a fail and 3 and above just be called pass? Well, there is a country that does that, and it's called Scotland. Scotland doesn't have food hygiene ratings. They've got their own system going on, and also they're not covered by the Food Standards Agency. They have their own body, which is called Food Standards Scotland.
The Food Hygiene Information Scheme is applied typically where food is supplied, sold or consumed. For a pass, you would be looking at a business that is broadly compliant with food hygiene requirements. So it's very much a kind of yes, no, either or. It may be that there are some minor things that are not a significant risk. However, if those minor contraventions are ones that are not rectified, then it would be improvement required.
Scotland's scheme is way simpler. Instead of a 0 to 5 rating that you have to watch a YouTube video to understand, it's just pass or improvements required. So why did the rest of the UK decide to go with this system that seems so much more complicated?
The idea that there was a 0 to 5 rating was to drive competition within businesses. You know, it was that idea that if a business with lower ratings had to display it, then, you know, businesses who'd worked really hard and achieved the higher ratings would get a competitive advantage. And our research shows that they do.
Do you remember in the food hygiene rating scheme how some contraventions could happen before you actually get below a 3 and breach that legal minimum standard? Well, under Scotland's system, the argument goes that there would be no incentive for restaurants to try and deal with those contraventions because they'd still get a pass anyway. But Scotland does have one more tool in its arsenal which it uses to try and deal with this problem. It's called the Eat Safe Award.
Eat Safe is basically when you've got a business that has sustained compliance at the highest level. So they're going above and beyond what is legally required, and that's on a sustained basis. Eat Safe is an award that a business can apply for. They can ask to be assessed for an Eat Safe award. It isn't something that's automatic.
So the Eat Safe Award is not quite the same as a 5 in food hygiene rating system. It's actually a greater achievement, but that also means it's a lot rarer. But we can understand now why you would want ratings and awards beyond the legal minimum to encourage restaurants to do even better. But what about those low ratings? Why do we need a 2 or a 1 or a 0? Like, if a restaurant's doing that badly, shouldn't it just be shut down?
So the food hygiene rating is the literal shop window of a very complex food hygiene kind of model that sits underneath it. But that officer's primary role is to ensure public safety. So if they go into a food business and they find something that's an imminent risk to public health, something that's going to make people sick, they can and they absolutely will close that business down if that's required. But depending on what they find, their range of enforcement will vary. So they might choose to shut down part of an operation. As I said, they might close the entire business down, or they might work really intensively with that business to put together an action plan to show them how they should address those and coming back until they're content.
I think that's a big thing to understand here. Food hygiene ratings are for the public, but there's a much bigger food hygiene and food safety enforcement system going on behind the scenes that we don't really need to know about. But one thing that both Karen at the Food Standards Agency and Lorna at Food Standards Scotland were keen to stress is that most of these businesses aren't sort of mustache twirling villains trying to poison everyone.
Most businesses don't set out and plan to get into that position. Things happen, and therefore in that situation you tend to find that the majority are quite willing to work with the authority.
Another thing that unites these two schemes, at least in England and Scotland, is that there's a big hole in them. Because in Wales and Northern Ireland, when a restaurant is given a food hygiene rating, they receive a sticker with that rating on. And they have to display that in their restaurant in a place that it can be seen by anyone who goes in there. But in Scotland and England, restaurants receive those stickers and then they're told, we'd really like it if you put this up, but you don't have to. And you might be thinking, well, if a restaurant gets a really low score and they're not required to display it, won't they just put that sticker in the bin? And you'd be right. In fact, the Food Standards Agency conducted research which found that in England, It's extremely rare to find a business with a rating below 3 that actually displays that rating, whereas in Wales, most of them do, because they have to. Introducing mandatory display of food hygiene ratings would require new regulations to be introduced, and the Food Standards Agency can't do that. But I wanted to ask them whether they have an official position on this.
Yes, we absolutely do. We would love to see food hygiene rating scheme put on a statutory footing in England as it is in Northern Ireland and Wales. In order to do that, there's a bit of parliamentary process that we have to go through, and the decision to do that rests with ministers. Even if it's not displayed in the business, you can go on our website on ratings.food.gov.uk and check your rating. It's a simple postcode search.
These days, there are restaurants that don't even have a physical location. They only exist on delivery apps. And I think in those cases, it's more vital than ever that this information be made available, because you don't even have the option of sort of feeling out the vibe of the restaurant. And this has caused some scandals over the years. In 2019, the BBC found that the delivery apps were hosting hundreds of restaurants that had a food hygiene rating of 1. In the years since then, the apps have tightened up their rules. There are 3 big delivery apps in the UK: Just Eat, Deliveroo, and Uber Eats. And in the case of Just Eat, restaurants are now required to have at least a 3 for food hygiene in order to be listed on the platform. Deliveroo and Uber Eats only require a 2. And in Scotland, to be clear, all 3 apps require a pass. But these apps are not legally required in any part of the UK to display these ratings. They've done it voluntarily. But in all cases, they're a bit hard to find. You have to go into the More Info page to actually find the rating. And I bet lots of people don't know it's there. I don't understand why we would go out and spend all this money and do all these inspections and give these ratings out and then just allow them to not be displayed. And statistically, you probably agree with me, because the Food Standards Agency's research has found overwhelming support for requiring these ratings to be displayed both in person and online. So I think this is probably an idea whose time will come. I think the biggest thing I've learned from this is that food hygiene is a lot more complicated than we give it credit for. There aren't just 2 types of restaurant, one with rats and one without. There's actually a spectrum, and there's loads of restaurants in the middle where maybe minor mistakes are being made. It's not a big problem right now, but it could be down the road. Management is cooperative, but it's not clear whether they're going to be able to turn it around. And in those cases, I can understand why it's helpful to have this 0 to 5 rating system to capture that nuance. But at the same time, you really can't beat Scotland's system for just pure clarity. It's so easy to understand. And you wouldn't need to watch a video like this to understand that 3 is the threshold for a restaurant that you should eat at. So anyway, hopefully now that you do know that 3 is the magic number, you understand the system a bit more. And with that, eat safe. What a stupid way to end a YouTube video.